Terrence Boykin was seated across the table from his father inside the reception parlor of Boykin and Sons Funeral Home on a Sunday morning before the doors opened to the public, and his father Cornelius was seated at the head of the small round table where the family had met to discuss business for 40 years, and his brother Malcolm was seated to Cornelius's right, in a suit that cost more than most of what the business took in during a slow week, and his mother Yvonne was seated quietly to the side with her hands folded in her lap. And Cornelius had called this meeting the way he called every meeting that mattered, by telling Terrence the night before that they needed to talk about the future of the business. And Terrence had come expecting a conversation and had walked into something that had already been decided before he arrived. Cornelius said that at 78 years old, with his health the way it was, he had decided it was time to formally hand the direction of Boykin and Sons over to Malcolm. And he said this while looking at a folder on the table in front of him that Terrence recognized immediately as a set of transition documents that had clearly been drafted by someone with legal training. And Cornelius said that he loved both of his sons, but that he had never fully trusted Terrence with money since the summer Terrence was 26 years old and had lost $11,000 of the business's reserve funds on an investment that Terrence had believed in and that had collapsed within 4 months. And Cornelius said that Malcolm had spent the last decade building a career in corporate sales in Atlanta and understood growth and understood risk in a way that Terrence, in Cornelius's words, had never fully recovered from understanding correctly. Terrence sat and listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he had listened to versions of this same assessment for 22 years. And when his father finished speaking and slid the folder toward the center of the table and said he needed Terrence's signature on the transition agreement by the end of the month, Terrence did not reach for the folder. He looked at his father, and he looked at his brother, and he looked at his mother, and he said, "This business is not yours to transition." And the room went still in the specific way a room goes still when someone has said something that does not match anyone else's understanding of reality. And Cornelius said, "What did you say?" And Terrence said, "I bought Boykin and Sons from you 11 years ago. It has been mine since the closing, and I have the documents to prove it. Stay with me." Because what Terrence Boykin had been quietly building since the year he sat across from an attorney named Renee Holloway and asked her to make sure that what he had built with his own hands could never be taken from him by a decision made in a room he was not fully part of, is the reason that folder on the table that morning meant nothing at all, and what Cornelius and Malcolm did not understand when they walked into that reception parlor with a transition agreement already drafted, is that the business they believed they were preparing to hand to the favored son had not belonged to their family in any legal sense for over a decade. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now if you have not already, because we tell the stories on this channel that nobody else is telling, and this community is growing every single day. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us. If your family called a meeting to hand your life's work to your sibling without asking you a single question first, what would your first words be? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you before this story is over. Baltimore, Maryland. Terrence Boykin was born in 1975 into a family that had run Boykin and Sons Funeral Home on Pennsylvania Avenue since his grandfather Alonzo Boykin founded it in 1951 with a single hearse he had purchased secondhand and a chapel space he rented above a barbershop for the first 4 years of the business's existence. And Terrence grew up understanding the business the way other children understand the layout of their own house. He knew which floorboards in the West Chapel creaked before he knew his multiplication tables. He had learned to iron a shirt collar correctly by the time he was 9, because his father believed that a man who could not present himself with dignity had no business being present with grieving families. And he had spent every summer of his adolescence doing the unglamorous work that a funeral home actually requires: moving chairs, learning the paperwork, sitting quietly in the back of arrangement conferences, and watching his father speak to families in the specific low, steady voice that the work demanded. By the time he was 14, Terrence had memorized the entire sequence of state licensing requirements simply from overhearing his father explain them to new employees. And by 15, he had begun quietly correcting small errors in the business's filing system that had gone unnoticed for years, a habit that Cornelius noticed and praised at the time, telling Yvonne within Terrence's hearing that the boy had an eye for detail that would serve the business well one day. This praise mattered to Terrence, and he carried it with him, and it made what came later feel less like a single mistake and more like a complete erasure of everything his father had once said about him. Cornelius Boykin had built the business into the most respected Black-owned funeral home on the east side of Baltimore over 3 decades of consistent, careful, unglamorous work, expanding from the single chapel his own father had rented into a full property with 2 chapels, a preparation room, and a small fleet of vehicles, and he had raised Terrence to inherit that consistency. And for the first 26 years of his life, Terrence had every reason to believe that the business and his father's trust were the same thing, and that both were his by birthright and by effort. Then came the summer of the investment. Terrence was 26 and had recently taken over more of the business's financial operations, handling the reserve accounts and the vendor payments that Cornelius had previously managed himself. And a family friend named Otis Pruitt, a man Cornelius had known since childhood and trusted implicitly, approached Terrence with an opportunity to invest a portion of the business's reserve funds into a real estate development on the west side of the city. The opportunity was presented with documentation that appeared sound, architectural renderings, projected timelines, letters of interest from prospective commercial tenants, and Otis spoke about it with the specific confidence of someone who had done this successfully before, which, as it turned out later, he had twice. Though the third venture would prove to be built on financing that was considerably less secure than either of the first 2. Terrence brought the opportunity to his father, laid out everything Otis had shown him, and Cornelius, who trusted Otis as well and who had known him for over 40 years, told Terrence to use his own judgment, that this was exactly the kind of decision Terrence needed to start making independently if he was going to run the business one day. Terrence used his judgment, and the judgment was wrong. Not recklessly wrong, not carelessly wrong in the way the word would come to be used against him for the next 2 decades, but wrong in the specific way that a genuinely careful decision can still be wrong when the person presenting the opportunity is himself concealing information. The development collapsed within 4 months when a lead investor withdrew unexpectedly and the project's permits were revoked over a zoning dispute nobody had disclosed, and $11,000 of the business's reserve funds were gone along with it. Terrence went to his father immediately. The same evening he learned the news, sat across from him, at the small round table in the reception parlor, and told him everything without a single detail softened or omitted. And then he said something that he would repeat to himself many times over the following 2 decades. He said, "I will make this right, however long it takes." And he worked for the following 18 months without taking a full salary, taking on additional embalming shifts and driving the removal van personally on nights the business would otherwise have paid an outside contractor to rebuild what had been lost. And he succeeded. The money was replaced in full. The business did not suffer any lasting operational damage. Otis Pruitt, for his part, apologized privately to Cornelius, but never once acknowledged to Terrence directly that the failure had originated in information Otis had withheld rather than in any error of Terrence's own judgment. But something in how Cornelius saw his older son had changed permanently in those 4 months, and no amount of subsequent competence over the following 2 decades, no 18 months of unpaid work, no flawless handling of thousands of family arrangements, no single missed payment or accounting error in over 20 years, ever fully undid it. Cornelius mentioned the investment, directly or indirectly, at nearly every significant family conversation for the next 22 years, not cruelly, not as an accusation exactly, but as a kind of permanent footnote that accompanied any moment where Terrence's judgment was under discussion, the specific quiet refrain of a father who had decided, once, in a moment of genuine financial fear, that his older son was careless with money, and who had never revised that decision even as the evidence in front of him for the next 2 decades said otherwise every single day. Malcolm Boykin was 6 years younger than Terrence and had grown up in the specific shadow of a brother who was already deeply embedded in the family business by the time Malcolm was old enough to understand what the business was. Malcolm was charismatic in the way that made people immediately comfortable around him. He had a natural gift for conversation and for making a room feel like it revolved around whoever he was speaking to, qualities that Cornelius valued visibly and openly, and that Terrence, without any resentment, genuinely admired in his younger brother as well. Malcolm had shown little interest in the funeral home as a teenager, choosing instead to pursue a business degree at Morgan State, and then a career in corporate pharmaceutical sales that took him first to Washington and then, 7 years later, to Atlanta, Malcolm called home regularly, visited for holidays, spoke warmly and often about his ambitions, describing quarterly targets and territory expansions, and, eventually, as the years went on, describing himself in increasingly senior-sounding terms that did not always precisely correspond to his actual title. And he consistently outperformed Terrence in the specific currency that mattered most to Cornelius, which was the appearance of forward motion. Malcolm talked about growth strategy and market expansion and leveraging brand equity, using language that sounded to a father who had built his life on unglamorous, careful work, like the language of someone who understood money in a way his older son, marked forever by one bad summer, apparently did not. What nobody in the family fully accounted for during these years was that Malcolm's corporate career, despite the impressive language, had been considerably less stable than it appeared from the outside. He had changed companies 3 times in 8 years, twice due to layoffs that he described to the family as strategic departures for better opportunities, and had accumulated significant personal debt, maintaining a lifestyle in Atlanta that outpaced his actual earnings, a leased luxury vehicle, a downtown apartment well beyond what his base salary alone could support, and a habit of covering the gap with commission projections that did not always materialize the way he had budgeted for, and had, on 2 separate occasions that he never mentioned to his parents, called Terrence privately, once late on a Thursday night with a voice that Terrence had not heard from his brother since they were teenagers, and asked for loans to cover shortfalls. The first was for $2,200 to cover a missed car payment before the vehicle could be repossessed. The second, 3 years later, was for closer to $6,000 during the gap between his second and third job changes when his severance had run out before his new position's first paycheck arrived. Terrence had given both loans without conditions, without a formal repayment schedule, and without ever once bringing them up at a family gathering, telling Malcolm only that he should focus on getting steady again and that they would settle it whenever it made sense, because Terrence had decided a long time ago that the specific accounting of who had failed at what was not a ledger he was interested in keeping against his own brother, even as that same ledger, one single entry 22 years old, was being kept, constantly and audibly, against him. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now because this story is about to show you exactly what Terrence built while everyone in his family believed he was standing still. And you need to be here for what happens next. Tell us in the comments. Has anyone in your family held one mistake against you for years while ignoring everything you did right afterward? Drop your answer below because we want to hear from you before this story is over. The specific afternoon that changed everything for Terrence happened 11 years before the meeting in the reception parlor. On an ordinary Wednesday when Cornelius, then 67, sat Terrence down in the same reception parlor and told him that he and Yvonne needed to access a significant amount of money for medical expenses related to a cardiac procedure that their insurance would only partially cover, and that he had been thinking, in the quiet way a man thinks about things he has been avoiding, about what to do with the business going forward, and Cornelius said, somewhat abruptly, that he wanted to sell Terrence a controlling stake in Boykin and Sons, formally, with real money changing hands, both to give himself and Yvonne financial security going into retirement, and, though he did not say this part directly, to finally settle the question of what would happen to the business without leaving it hanging over the family as an unresolved inheritance that his sons might one day fight over. Cornelius said, almost as an aside, that Malcolm was building his own career and did not need this the way Terrence did, a comment Terrence noted quietly at the time and would think back on often in the years that followed. Terrence agreed immediately and without hesitation. He had spent his entire adult life inside that building, and the idea of formally owning what he had already been running for years felt less like an acquisition and more like a correction of the record. He took his savings, took out a business loan against the property itself, and over the course of 4 months worked with an attorney named Renee Holloway, a Baltimore business and estate lawyer who had been recommended to him by a longtime family friend and who had a reputation, Terrence had been told, for closing agreements so thoroughly that nobody ever needed to revisit them. Renee walked Terrence through every implication of what he was doing across 3 separate meetings in her downtown office. She explained that once the agreement closed, Boykin and Sons Funeral Home LLC would belong to Terrence Boykin alone, that Cornelius would receive his payment and would retain no ownership stake whatsoever unless a future document specifically created one. She reviewed the valuation of the business line by line, the property, the vehicle fleet, the client relationships, the licensing, and she asked Terrence directly, more than once, whether he understood that this meant the business would no longer be, in any legal sense, a family asset that could be redistributed by his parents at a later date. And Terrence said he understood completely, and he said something to Renee that afternoon that she would remember for over a decade afterward, and would later tell Terrence she had thought about many times when reading through his file after the reception parlor meeting became public knowledge among the small circle who knew. He said, "I am not doing this to take anything from anyone. I am doing this because I have learned that the things you love the most in your family are also the things that get discussed the least clearly, and I would rather have paper that says what is true than a lifetime of assuming everyone remembers the same story the same way." Renee filed the paperwork. The sale closed on a Tuesday morning in March at her office, Cornelius signing with a fountain pen he had owned since his own father gave it to him, and Cornelius received a substantial payment that solved his and Yvonne's medical and retirement concerns completely. And as they stood outside Renee's office afterward, Cornelius shook Terrence's hand and said, "Keep it running the way I built it," words that would become, over the following 11 years, one of the more quietly ironic sentences in the entire history of the Boykin family. And for the following 11 years, Terrence ran Boykin and Sons exactly as he always had, quietly, competently, without ever once mentioning to anyone outside of Renee's office that the business was now, in every legal sense that mattered, entirely and exclusively his. What made the following 11 years remarkable was not that Terrence hid this fact out of deception. It was that the fact simply never came up in a way that required stating. Cornelius continued coming into the funeral home, most days out of habit and love for the place he had built, arriving each morning at the same hour he always had, greeting the same longtime employees, walking the same rooms. He continued introducing himself to grieving families as though the business remained his, and Terrence, watching from the arrangement office, never once corrected him in front of a family. He continued referring to Boykin and Sons in conversation, at church, at community events, in casual conversation with old friends, as our family business, and Terrence, out of respect for his father's dignity and out of a genuine unwillingness to strip an aging man of the identity he had built his entire life around, never corrected him, never once said, "Dad, this technically belongs to me now," in front of anyone, not at holidays, not at church, not in the 11 years of ordinary days that made up the bulk of the time between the sale and the meeting in the reception parlor. This silence was not strategy in the beginning. It was simply kindness. But as the years went on and Cornelius's comments about Terrence being careless with money continued, unchanged and unrevised by 11 straight years of Terrence successfully running a business his father did not realize he no longer owned, the silence began to carry a different weight. Terrence began to understand, slowly and without ever fully articulating it even to himself, that the paperwork sitting in Renee Holloway's files was not just a business transaction. It was a form of protection he had built for himself at 29 years old without knowing exactly what he was protecting himself from, and that the protection was going to matter someday in a way he could not yet fully picture. His wife Simone, whom he met at a mutual friend's wedding 2 years before the business sale and married the year after the sale closed, was the only person outside of Renee's office who fully understood the situation from the beginning. Simone was a high school guidance counselor with the specific patience of someone whose entire profession involved watching young people misunderstand their own situations and gently helping them see clearly. She had grown up in a family with its own complicated dynamics between an older and younger sibling, and she recognized in the Boykin family a pattern she had seen before, and she had watched, over the years of their marriage, the particular rhythm. Malcolm's return to Baltimore began roughly 2 years before the meeting in the reception parlor, prompted, though Malcolm never framed it this way explicitly to his parents, by a combination of a difficult breakup that had ended his engagement, a fourth job change in 9 years following a company-wide restructuring, and a mounting personal debt that had become difficult to manage on a sales income that had grown considerably less reliable than it once was. Malcolm began visiting Baltimore more frequently, staying for longer stretches, initially 2 or 3 days at a time, and eventually, as his Atlanta situation grew more unstable, entire weeks, and he began speaking to Cornelius with increasing specificity about wanting to bring his corporate experience home to modernize and expand what he called, in a phrase that made Terrence quietly wince every time he heard it, the family legacy. Malcolm spoke about pre-need insurance packages and digital marketing and expanding into event and celebration of life services as a growth category. Ideas that were not without merit in the abstract, but that Malcolm presented with a confidence about execution that Terrence, having actually run the operational side of a funeral home for 2 decades, privately understood to be considerably more complicated in practice than in a pitch deck. Cornelius, whose health had begun declining noticeably over the same period, with 2 hospitalizations for cardiac issues in 18 months, responded to Malcolm's interest with visible relief and enthusiasm. Here, finally, was the son who understood growth, who understood risk, who had not spent the last 2 decades, in Cornelius's private assessment, simply maintaining what already existed rather than expanding it, an assessment that conveniently overlooked that Boykin and Sons had, under Terrence's quiet management, actually grown its client base by nearly 40% over those same 2 decades, added a second chapel, and paid off every piece of debt on the property, none of which Cornelius framed as growth because it had happened gradually and without announcement. Cornelius began speaking to Malcolm privately about the future of the business, meetings that Terrence was aware of but not included in, small conversations after Sunday dinner that stretched longer each week. And it was during this period, roughly 8 months before the reception parlor meeting, that Cornelius quietly retained an attorney of his own, not Renee Holloway, a different Baltimore attorney whom Malcolm had recommended through a colleague, to begin drafting what Cornelius understood to be transition documents that would formally shift operational control of Boykin and Sons to Malcolm. Cornelius believed, sincerely and without any intention of deception, that he was doing something entirely within his rights as the founder's son and the man who had run the business for 30 years. He did not consult the original 2001 records of the business's ownership history because it did not occur to him that he needed to. In his own understanding of the situation, formed and reinforced over 11 years of Terrence's respectful silence, Boykin and Sons remained, as it always had been, a Boykin family asset that the family patriarch retained the right to direct. Yvonne, for her part, said very little during these 8 months. She had learned decades earlier that her husband's decisions about the business were not conversations she was invited into as an equal participant, though she confided to a longtime friend from church, weeks before the reception parlor meeting, that something about the whole plan felt rushed to her in a way she could not fully name, and that Terrence had built something real in that building over all those years, something Malcolm had never once shown up early to help with. The meeting in the reception parlor that opened this story was the culmination of those 8 months of quiet planning between Cornelius and Malcolm, a plan built entirely on an assumption that had been technically false for 11 years, and that nobody involved in building the plan had thought to verify. Cornelius had told Terrence the night before only that they needed to talk about the future of the business, giving no indication of what had already been drafted, and when Terrence walked into that Sunday morning meeting and saw the folder on the table and understood within the first 90 seconds exactly what kind of conversation this was going to be, he did something he had not done in 22 years of quietly absorbing his father's doubts. He stopped absorbing, and when he told his father that the business had not been Cornelius's to transition for 11 years, the reaction in that room unfolded in 3 distinct stages, each one more difficult for Cornelius and Malcolm to process than the last. The first stage was disbelief. Cornelius insisted, with genuine and unguarded confusion rather than anger, that this could not be correct, that he would certainly remember selling his own business. And he looked to Yvonne as though she might contradict what he was hearing. But Yvonne, who had been present at the closing 11 years earlier as a witness and whose signature was in fact on one of the ancillary documents, said quietly, "Cornelius, you signed the papers. I was there." And Terrence, calmly and without any satisfaction in his voice, described the exact circumstances of the sale, the medical expenses, the retirement concerns, the 4 months of work with Renee Holloway, the fountain pen, and Cornelius's face, Terrence would say later, went through the specific transformation of a man watching a memory he had filed away as something else entirely reassemble itself in front of him into what it had actually been the whole time. Cornelius did remember the sale, He had simply, over 11 years, allowed himself to stop understanding what the sale had legally meant, treating the substantial payment he received as something closer to a large gift or an early inheritance distribution rather than what it actually was, a complete and final transfer of ownership. The second stage, arriving within the same conversation once the initial shock passed, was an attempt at negotiation. Cornelius said that whatever the paperwork said, the family's understanding had always been different, that Terrence surely did not intend to shut his own brother out of the business their grandfather built, and Malcolm, visibly shaken but recovering his composure quickly in the specific way that 8 years of sales training teaches a person to recover composure, suggested that perhaps this could still work, that Terrence could simply choose to bring him on as an equal partner now, voluntarily, as a gesture of family unity, and Terrence, who had spent 11 years absorbing every version of being called careless with money, said something that Simone would later tell me was the calmest and most devastating thing she had ever heard her husband say. He said, "I am not interested in negotiating something that already legally belongs to me. If you want to be part of this business, Malcolm, you are welcome to apply for a position here the same way anyone else would. And we can discuss compensation and responsibilities the way any employer discusses them with any employee, but I will not be signing away 11 years of ownership because a meeting was called and a folder was placed on a table." Malcolm started to respond and then stopped himself. And for a long moment nobody in the reception parlor said anything at all. The third stage, the one that took the longest to fully settle in, was the specific and quiet reckoning of understanding what came next. In the weeks following that Sunday morning, 3 sequential realities arrived, each one closing off a door that Cornelius and Malcolm had believed remained open. The first was that Malcolm, who had already begun quietly discussing his transition plans with a small number of long-time funeral home clients and vendors, describing himself informally as the incoming operational lead, discovered when he attempted to formalize a business relationship with a casket supplier under the Boykin and Sons name, that he had no legal standing to represent the company in any capacity whatsoever. The vendor's compliance department, following standard verification procedures, contacted the LLC's registered agent, which was Renee Holloway's office, and was informed clearly that Malcolm Boykin held no ownership interest, no operational authority, and no legal standing to bind the company to any agreement. The vendor representative, confused, called Malcolm back to ask if there had been some kind of misunderstanding, and Malcolm, for the first time in this entire process, had no confident answer to give. The second reality arrived when Cornelius, still processing the full weight of what had happened, asked his own attorney to review whether any claim existed that could challenge the original 2001 sale, and that attorney, after reviewing Renee Holloway's thoroughly documented closing file, which included appraisals, signed disclosures, and Cornelius's own notarized acknowledgement that he understood the transaction was final, told Cornelius plainly that the sale had been executed correctly, that Cornelius had received full and fair consideration at the time, and that no viable legal challenge existed after 11 years of an uncontested transaction. The attorney told Cornelius, according to what Cornelius later told Yvonne, that in 20 years of practice he had rarely seen a closing file this thoroughly documented, and that whoever had structured it clearly understood exactly what they were protecting against. The third reality, and the one that Terrence has told me mattered to him the least in practical terms, but the most in personal ones, was the slow and painful recognition within the extended family and the church community that had known the Boykins for decades, that Cornelius's public framing of Terrence as the careless son had been, for over a decade, factually disconnected from a reality in which that same careless son had been the one quietly and successfully running, growing, and financially sustaining the business that fed the entire family's sense of legacy. Word moved slowly through the congregation at Mount Olive Baptist, where the Boykins had worshipped for 3 generations, and Terrence found himself, in the weeks after, receiving a specific kind of quiet acknowledgement from older members of the church, men and women who had known him since he was a boy sweeping floors in that funeral home. That felt to him less like vindication and more like something he had not realized he was still waiting for. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now because this story is about to show you what happened when Cornelius's health took a turn and the family discovered exactly who they actually depended on. And you need to be here for this part. Tell us in the comments. Do you think Terrence should have told his father the truth years earlier, or was his patience the right choice? We want your honest answer before this story is over. Cornelius suffered a more serious cardiac event 4 months after the meeting in the reception parlor, requiring an extended hospital stay at Johns Hopkins and a lengthy recovery period during which he could not return to the funeral home at all. And it was during this period, more than at any point during the confrontation itself, that the practical weight of what had actually been true for 11 years became fully visible to the entire family. Malcolm, despite his corporate sales background and his confident language about growth and modernization, had never actually learned the operational specifics of running a funeral home. He did not know the licensing requirements, did not have relationships with the specific network of clergy, cemeteries, and grief counselors that a functioning funeral home depends on daily, did not know how to properly complete a death certificate filing or coordinate with the state's vital records office, and had no legal authority to sign anything on the business's behalf even if he had known what needed signing. When a family came in during that period needing arrangements made within 48 hours, it was Terrence, not Malcolm, who sat with them, and Malcolm, watching from the side of a room he had spent 8 months believing would soon be his to direct, began to understand something about the actual weight of the work that no pitch deck had ever prepared him for. Terrence, who had never for one day stopped running the business exactly as he always had, simply continued running it. He visited his father in the hospital nearly every day, often before opening the funeral home in the morning and sometimes again after closing at night. He did not bring up the meeting, did not bring up the folder, did not use his father's vulnerability as an occasion to extract an apology or an acknowledgement. He brought coffee from the shop Cornelius liked 2 blocks from the hospital and sat with him and talked about ordinary things, the weather, a family from church, a repair the West Chapel roof needed, and slowly, over the weeks of that recovery, something in how Cornelius spoke about his older son began, quietly and without any single dramatic moment, to change. Yvonne told Simone privately during this period, sitting together in the hospital cafeteria on a Thursday afternoon while Cornelius slept, that Cornelius had started saying things to her at night that he had never said before, that he had spent 22 years measuring one summer against everything that came after it, and that the measuring had never once been fair, and that he did not know how to say this to Terrence directly without it sounding like it was only about the business now that the business was already gone from his hands. Yvonne said she told him, "Cornelius, it was never going to sound like it was only about the business. Say it anyway." Terrence Boykin is 49 years old now. Boykin and Sons Funeral Home remains fully and solely his, exactly as it has been since the sale closed 11 years ago, and exactly as it will continue to be. The business has grown further in the 2 years since the reception parlor meeting, adding a small pre-need planning office that Terrence built and staffed himself, carefully, the way he builds everything. Cornelius has recovered enough to visit the business a few days a week, no longer as its owner in title or in fact, but as its founder's son and as Terrence's father, a role that Terrence has told me matters far more to him now than any acknowledgement or apology ever could, though the acknowledgement did eventually come, quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday roughly a year after the hospital stay, when Cornelius asked Terrence to walk with him through the West Chapel and told him, without any preamble, that he had been wrong about the investment for 22 years, not about the money. The money had been a real loss and a real mistake in judgment on a bad piece of information, but wrong about what it meant, and wrong to have let one summer define how he saw the rest of his son's life. Terrence has told me that he did not need to hear those words by that point, that he had made his peace with his father's version of him many years earlier, but that hearing them anyway meant more than he expected it to. Malcolm did not take a position at the funeral home. He returned to Atlanta roughly 6 months after the reception parlor meeting and has, according to Yvonne, begun rebuilding a more modest and more honest version of his career, one built without the assumption that a family legacy would eventually be handed to him regardless of what he had actually built himself. He calls Terrence more often now than he used to, and the 2 brothers have, slowly, begun rebuilding something between them that is different from what it was before, not without complication, but real. Terrence told me that the thing he thinks about most from those 11 years of silence is not the meeting itself and not the 3 realities that followed it in sequence, The thing he thinks about most is the afternoon in Renee Holloway's office when he said, "I would rather have paper that says what is true than a lifetime of assuming everyone remembers the same story the same way," because that sentence, spoken at 29 years old before he fully understood why he needed it, turned out to be the exact and complete explanation for everything that followed. He also thinks about the 18 months after he lost $11,000 at 26. The months he worked without a full salary to make it right without being asked to. And about how that specific season of quiet accountability, the season his father used for 22 years as proof of his carelessness, was in fact the clearest evidence available of exactly the opposite. Here is what stays with me about Terrence Boykin. His father spent over 2 decades building a story about his older son around a single summer. A story so consistent and so repeated that it eventually became the operating assumption behind an entire transition plan involving legal documents and a favored younger son. And what nobody in that plan accounted for was that the son they believed had never fully recovered his judgment had, 11 years earlier, exercised exactly the kind of judgment his father claimed he lacked. He had looked clearly at a pattern of doubt that showed no sign of ending, and rather than arguing with it, rather than demanding to be seen differently, he had simply gone and made the facts of his life legally, permanently true, on paper, in a way that a family meeting and a folder could never undo. Cornelius had spent years calling his son careless with money while that same son had already, quietly, made himself the single, most financially secure and legally protected person in the entire family. The distance between the story Cornelius told about his son and the reality his son had actually built is the entire story, and it is a distance that closed only when circumstances forced it to, not because anyone finally said the right words out loud. So here's what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about patience. Terrence knew for 11 years that his father did not understand the true legal reality of the business, and he chose, repeatedly, not to correct him. Do you think that patience was a genuine kindness toward an aging father? Or do you think Terrence should have told the truth years earlier and spared himself over a decade of being called careless for a mistake he had long since made right? And the second question is about Cornelius. He built an entire plan for his family's future around an assumption he never once thought to verify. Do you think Cornelius's failure was really about doubting Terrence specifically? Or do you think it says something larger about how easily families build entire narratives around old mistakes and simply stop checking whether those narratives are still true? Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and this story is going to produce a comment conversation that runs for a very long time. If this story made you think about the old story someone in your family still tells about you, and whether that story is still true, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Hit the like button if Terrence Boykin reminded you of someone you know. And subscribe to Psyche Tales TV because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is here with us. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.